There is a question that historians rarely ask, because the answer is too uncomfortable. Why did the 20th century kill so many people? Not why did wars happen? Wars have always happened. But why did they happen at that scale? Why did the conflicts of the modern era produce casualties that would have been unimaginable to any general, any king, any emperor in the 10,000 years of recorded human violence that came before? Why did 2 world wars kill somewhere between 70 and 85 million people? Why did the mechanized slaughter of the Western Front, the firebombing of Dresden, the siege of Leningrad, the industrialized extermination of entire peoples, why did all of this happen in the most technologically advanced, most educated, most supposedly enlightened century in human history? The standard answer is technology. We built better weapons. We built planes and tanks and artillery and eventually nuclear devices that could erase a city in a single moment. And yes, technology mattered. But technology is a tool. Tools do not deploy themselves. Tools require decisions, and decisions require resources. The question that almost nobody asks is, where did the money come from? Because here is what most people do not understand about industrial war. It's not primarily a military problem. It is a financial one. The limiting constraint on violence throughout virtually all of human history was not willingness. It was not hatred. It was not ambition. It was money. War is extraordinarily expensive. Soldiers need to be paid. They need to be fed, clothed, armed, transported, and continuously supplied across hundreds or thousands of miles of hostile terrain for months or years at a stretch. For most of human history, this simple financial reality acted as a natural governor on the scale of conflict. You could not wage a war you could not afford. And you could not afford a war that your citizens would not fund. This is the mechanism that almost nobody talks about. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Throughout the era of sound money, when currencies were backed by gold and silver, when governments could not simply conjure money into existence by decree, the funding of war was a direct and immediate burden on the population. Kings levied taxes. Parliaments debated war bonds. Citizens felt the cost of conflict in their daily lives almost immediately. Prices rose. Luxuries disappeared. The burden was visible, tangible, and personal. This created a natural and powerful friction against the initiation of large-scale conflict. Populations that had to pay directly for war were populations that had a very immediate interest in wars being short, decisive, and infrequent. John Maynard Keynes, who is in many ways the intellectual architect of the modern monetary order, and not someone who would have agreed with where this argument is heading, wrote something genuinely important in 1919 in The Economic Consequences of the Peace. He observed that the financing of the First World War had required all the major powers to essentially abandon the fiscal discipline that the gold standard imposed. They suspended convertibility. They printed money. They borrowed against futures that did not yet exist. And he understood even then that this represented a profound rupture, not just economically, but civilizationally. The war did not just spend treasure. It spent the monetary architecture that had, for generations, constrained what governments could do. What Keynes did not fully reckon with, perhaps could not allow himself to reckon with, was that this rupture was not an accident of war. It was a precondition for it. Let that sit for a moment. The First World War could not have been fought at the scale it was fought if the major European powers had remained on the gold standard. This is not a polemical claim. It is a financial fact. The war cost Britain alone approximately 40% of its entire national wealth. France spent resources it would not finish repaying until the 21st century. Germany, facing a two-front war and a naval blockade, should by any reasonable economic calculation have been forced to sue for peace within months. Instead, the war lasted 4 years and killed 17 million people. It lasted because governments found a mechanism to fund violence without asking their citizens to pay for it directly and immediately. They printed money. They debased their currencies. They inflated away the purchasing power of savings held by ordinary people who had no vote on whether the war continued. Inflation, in this context, was not an economic side effect. It was a war financing technology. And this is the thing that should disturb you. Because the decision to fund a war through monetary expansion rather than direct taxation is not just a financial choice, it is a moral one. It is a choice to transfer the cost of violence from those who decide to wage war to those who hold savings. It is a choice to make the funding of mass death invisible, diffuse, and deniable. Governments throughout history have understood, at some level, that populations who can feel the cost of war directly will eventually demand it stop. The genius, if that is the right word, and I do not think it is, the dark genius of fiat war financing is that it severs the connection between cost and consent. When a medieval king wanted to go to war, he had to go to his nobles, his merchants, his church. He had to make a case. He had to secure explicit buy-in from people who controlled real resources and who would feel the drain immediately. War required persuasion. It required a political coalition willing to bear a visible, quantifiable cost. When a modern government wants to go to war, it calls its central bank. No vote, no debate about tax rates, no moment at which ordinary citizens are handed a bill and asked to sign off. The cost is distributed invisibly across the entire money supply, felt as a subtle erosion of purchasing power that most people will never connect to the specific policy that caused it. The Treasury issues bonds. The central bank purchases them with newly created money. The war machine is funded. And somewhere across the country, a retired teacher on a fixed income loses a fraction of the value of her savings, with no knowledge of why, no recourse, and no representation in the decision that caused it. This is not incidental to modern war. It is the mechanism of modern war. Think about what this means for the actual calculus of conflict. If you are a head of state, and the cost of initiating military action must be paid immediately and visibly by your own population, you face a very powerful constraint. Your citizens will feel it. They will ask whether it is worth it. They will demand accountability. The political cost of starting a war that goes badly is potentially catastrophic. These constraints do not make war impossible. Human nature being what it is, wars happened on the gold standard too. But they impose a friction. They impose a seriousness. They impose an honesty about what is being asked and who is paying. Remove that constraint, and you change the entire moral architecture of the decision. The philosopher Michael Huemer, in his work on political authority and the ethics of state power, makes an argument that cuts directly to this point, though he approaches it from a different angle. He asks us to consider what we would say about the morality of an action if an ordinary individual, rather than a government, performed it. If a private citizen took money from his neighbors without their consent to fund a project they had not approved, we would call it theft. The fact that the mechanism is indirect, that it operates through currency debasement rather than direct seizure, does not change the underlying moral structure of the act. It simply makes it harder to identify, harder to resist, and therefore easier to repeat. And it has been repeated, constantly, across the entire modern era. The Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, the decades of Cold War proxy conflicts across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. None of these conflicts, at the scale they were prosecuted, would have been financially sustainable under a hard money standard. They were sustained by the ability of governments to fund violence through monetary expansion, by the ability to make the true cost of war legible only to economists and historians, years or decades after the fact, when the moral urgency of opposition had long passed. This is not to say that every war in the modern era was unjust. Some of them probably were necessary. Some of the interventions, whatever their costs, may have prevented worse outcomes. That is a separate debate, and a legitimate one. The point here is not about the justness of any particular war. The point is about the mechanism that made them possible at that scale, at that duration, at that frequency. Because when you look at the history of conflict through the lens of monetary architecture, something remarkable becomes visible. The frequency and scale of war does not simply track human hatred or political ambition. It tracks the availability of monetary expansion. It tracks the moments when governments freed themselves from the discipline of hard money and gained access to the bottomless printing press. The wars got bigger when the gold standard weakened. They got longer when central banks became more powerful. They got more frequent as the connection between monetary policy and military spending became more normalized, more institutionalized, more invisible. This is not a coincidence. It is a system. And like all systems, it has a logic. The logic of fiat war financing is this: the people who pay for the war are not the people who decide to fight it. The people who bear the cost are not the people who bear the risk. The people whose savings are quietly inflated away to fund military operations overseas have no seat at the table where those operations are planned. And because the cost is invisible, because it is distributed and deniable and diffuse, there is no natural stopping point. There is no moment at which the bill arrives and the population looks at the number and says, "Enough." There is a phrase that has been used to describe the financial architecture of the modern world: too big to fail. But the deeper truth, the one that sits beneath that phrase like bedrock, is that the system was designed to be too diffuse to resist. Complexity is not a bug of fiat monetary systems. It is their most important feature. When no one can trace the line from monetary policy to body count, when the distance between the printing press and the battlefield is filled with enough institutional abstraction, enough bureaucratic language, enough elapsed time, the accountability dissolves. And when accountability dissolves, the behavior it would have constrained continues and escalates and becomes normal. This is what we have normalized: the permanent war economy, the standing assumption that military operations are simply a line item, adjustable by committee, fundable on demand, the quiet cultural acceptance that governments will always find the money for war, somehow, and that the finding of it is a technical matter beneath the attention of ordinary citizens. We have built an entire civilization around this assumption. We have structured our institutions, our international law, our geopolitical arrangements, around the premise that states with central banks and fiat currencies can project violence at scale indefinitely, constrained only by political will and not by financial reality. And we have decided to call this order. Now consider what sound money actually does to this architecture, not as a policy preference, not as an economic school of thought, but as a structural fact. Hard money does not make humans peaceful. This cannot be said clearly enough because the argument being made here is often caricatured as naive, as a claim that gold coins somehow suppress the violence in human nature. That is not the argument. Human beings have always been capable of war. They always will be. The question is not about human nature. The question is about the conditions under which the worst expressions of human nature are enabled at civilizational scale. And on that question, monetary architecture is decisive. Under a hard money standard, the honest cost of war must be paid honestly. There is no mechanism for silent extraction. There is no way to fund a decade-long occupation by quietly eroding the savings of pensioners in towns whose names the generals cannot pronounce. If you want to fight a war, you must tax. You must borrow at rates that reflect real risk, from lenders who will demand real repayment, with real consequences if you cannot deliver. You must go to your population with a number, an actual, visible, undeniable number, and you must ask them whether it is worth it. This is not a guarantee of peace. It is something more important than a guarantee. It is a mechanism of honesty. It forces the decision to wage war into the open, where it belongs, where it can be evaluated, debated, and potentially refused. The historian Niall Ferguson, in his work on the relationship between financial markets and military conflict, has shown that the bond markets of the 19th century functioned as a remarkably effective constraint on state violence. When governments ran out of credit, wars ended. When lenders lost confidence, campaigns collapsed. The market imposed a discipline that political systems could not always impose on themselves. It is not a romantic story. Financial markets have their own corruptions, their own moral failures. But the underlying mechanism was sound. The cost of violence was real, visible, and borne by identifiable parties who had the power to withdraw consent. Bitcoin does not restore the gold standard. It does something more radical. It makes that mechanism mathematically permanent and institutionally unco-optable. This is worth sitting with, because it is easy to miss the depth of what is being said here. Every previous form of sound money, gold, silver, commodity-backed currency, was ultimately vulnerable to the same failure mode. It could be confiscated. It could be revalued. Governments could mandate, as Roosevelt did in 1933, that citizens surrender their gold at a fixed price. The link between the monetary standard and sound money discipline was always, in the final analysis, enforced by institutions, by central banks, by governments, by legal regimes that could be changed. And they were changed. Every single time the cost of maintaining monetary discipline conflicted with the desire to fund state violence, the discipline gave way. Because the institutions that were supposed to enforce it were the same institutions that wanted to abandon it. Bitcoin removes that vulnerability by removing the institution. The 21 million cap is not a policy. It is not a rule that a committee can revise. It is not a promise that a government can break when the political calculus shifts. It is mathematics, enforced by a decentralized network of participants who have no central authority to petition, no override mechanism to activate, no emergency clause to invoke. The scarcity of Bitcoin cannot be suspended for the duration of hostilities. It cannot be quietly modified by executive order. It cannot be eroded by the decisions of appointed technocrats in a building on Constitution Avenue. This means that a world in which Bitcoin functions as a monetary foundation is a world in which the hidden subsidy for war does not exist. Not because anyone has banned war, not because human nature has been reformed, but because the mechanism by which modern states fund violence without visible consent has been structurally eliminated. If you want to wage war in a Bitcoin world, you must find the real resources to do it. You must tax. You must persuade. You must make the case to people who will feel the cost immediately and personally, and you must do it in public, with numbers that cannot be hidden. Some will argue this is utopian, that states will find other mechanisms, that power always finds a way. And there is something to this. It would be intellectually dishonest to claim that sound money is a complete solution to political violence. Power is adaptive. The desire to dominate is old. But systems matter. Friction matters. The difference between a mechanism that makes war cheap and invisible and a mechanism that makes war expensive and transparent is not the difference between utopia and dystopia. It is the difference between the 20th century and the centuries that came before it. It is the difference between world wars and the more limited, more negotiated, more frequently exhausted conflicts of the pre-Fiat era. We do not need to abolish violence from the human heart. We need to raise the cost of industrialized violence to a level where the people who bear the cost are the people who make the decision. That is all. That simple structural alignment, cost and consent residing in the same hands, changes everything about the frequency, scale, and duration of conflict. There is a deeper point here that touches on something almost philosophical about what money actually is. Money is not just a medium of exchange. Money is a language in which societies communicate about value, about priority, about what is worth sacrificing for. When that language is corrupted, when it can be manipulated by those with access to the monetary mechanism, it does not just distort prices. It distorts the moral calculus of entire civilizations. It makes certain costs invisible. It makes certain decisions appear less costly than they are. It enables a kind of collective delusion about what is being spent and why. Sound money does not just restore financial discipline. It restores moral legibility. It makes the true cost of things visible. It forces civilizations to look honestly at what they are choosing to pay for, with what, and on whose behalf. And when civilizations can see that clearly, they sometimes, not always but sometimes, make different choices. This is the Bitcoin thesis that almost no one in the mainstream conversation is willing to engage with seriously because it implicates too much. It implicates the entire architecture of modern statecraft. It implicates the relationship between central banking and military power that has been so thoroughly normalized that most people cannot see it as a relationship at all, cannot see that the institution that controls the money supply and the institution that funds the military are not separate phenomena operating in parallel, but a single system with a single logic. Bitcoin is not simply a better savings technology. It is not simply a hedge against inflation, though it is that. It is a fundamental challenge to the monetary mechanism that has underwritten state violence at industrial scale for 100 years. It is the first time in human history that human beings have had access to a monetary system that cannot be conscripted, that cannot be called up by a central bank on behalf of a defense ministry. That cannot be quietly devalued to fill the gap between what a war costs and what a population would willingly pay. Every government that watches its citizens adopt Bitcoin is watching something genuinely threatening, not to national security, but to the specific financial architecture that makes a certain kind of national security spending possible. That is why the resistance is so institutional, so persistent, and so poorly explained by any other hypothesis. Sound money is not a technical inconvenience. It is an existential challenge to the machinery of fiat war. We built that machinery in the 20th century, and we paid for it in blood. Tens of millions of people died in conflicts whose duration and scale were made possible by the ability of governments to print money faster than their populations could object. That is the history. It is documented. It is not contested. What is contested, what has been carefully kept out of the mainstream conversation, is the causal link between that monetary architecture and that carnage. This channel exists to make that link visible, to follow the argument wherever it leads, regardless of how uncomfortable the destination, to take money seriously as the foundational layer of civilization, the thing that shapes everything built on top of it, including the decision to destroy. This is not a channel about price. It's a channel about civilization. Subscribe.